Ready to rock and roll?
Why not?
Good to go.
All right, I'm going to start the party. Welcome to the smartest people in the room. We are so glad you are here with us, and just by showing up, you are already demonstrating your very own smarts. Today, we are pleased to deliver a dream pairing of global music executive royalty, one appearing from France and the other from Northern California. More on that in a moment. It's also great to be back after we took off about 3 weeks around the 4th of July holiday. It's wonderful to be back. So welcome back yourselves. Before we get started, let me take care of some business. First, to the audience, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat window. The reason we do these webinars is twofold. First, we want to showcase really smart people and the amazing work they do day to day in the music industry. But the second reason is a bit more nuanced. Many of you know that I am a music industry headhunter. I place music executives in roles throughout the industry. So by definition and function, I help people connect with companies. In this series, my goal is to help you make more connections, and I invite you to take full advantage of that opportunity. Specifically, I invite you to engage with the speakers and the other attendees in the chat of the Zoom. Please introduce yourselves, share your LinkedIn profile, say hello to your friends, and make some new ones. And please ask questions of our speakers. We will try to address as many of those as possible during the interview. And please make sure your chat is set to address speakers and attendees. I want to thank our program sponsors for their support. Thank you to First Horizon Bank, Bufkin Baker, Four Roses Bourbon, the Tennessee Entertainment Commission, Lightning 100, Tennessee Brewworks, Moo TV, Jive Printing, Project Music, and Cushmaster's brand of CBD products. So let's get started. In today's host seat, we welcome back my good friend and entertainment connector extraordinaire, Kelli Richards. Kelli is a seasoned business development executive in digital media, especially in music tech, and a SWAT team strategist with a strong proven track record in identifying opportunities and driving a vision to life from concept to execution. She has established long-term trusted relationships with stakeholders across the ecosystem, including mainstream talent, content creators, media execs, tech innovators and leaders, brand execs, and investors. As a super connector, she's curated an enviable network that at best affords her 1 degree of separation from virtually anyone in the space. Kelli started out as a young A&R exec at EMI Music and went on to launch and drive Apple's earliest initiatives in music and entertainment during her lengthy tenure there prior to launching her own consulting practice. She's been a talent producer on a myriad of award shows and private fundraiser events, working with a cross-section of some of the biggest talent on the planet. Kelli is a trusted advisor to high achievers, typically out of tech or entertainment, who are looking to reinvent themselves around what matters most to them as they contemplate what's next. She holds an MBA and has been honored as a top 100 women of influence by Silicon Valley Business Journal. Welcome back, Kelli. So glad you're here.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be here again.
And joining Kelli as today's special guest is Miles Copeland. Miles is an articulate and charismatic businessman, entrepreneur, and influencer with a track record of being at the forefront of innovation in the music and entertainment industries. His constant focus on evolution and revolution is dominant throughout his varied and successful career, which spans 5 decades and is littered with household names. From being the center of the British progressive rock and punk rock scenes in the late 60s and 70s, to launching record labels and managing hugely successful bands and musicians such as The Police, Sting, Squeeze, REM, The Bangles, Miles spent over 30 years working with artists who dominated the charts in the US, the UK, and across the world. His inspiring ability to manage and grow talent, identify and influence changes in the market, and develop highly creative and innovative promotional strategies has resulted in countless hits, singles, and albums, Grammy Awards, gold and platinum records, as well as some surprising but hugely successful collaborations. Meanwhile, his latest series of live touring projects is focused on creating a brand that can operate successfully with whatever artists might be available at any given time, creating both ownership and longevity for each concept. Miles' entrepreneurial approach has enabled him to find solutions when routes to market were closed or evolve his business model when the internet fundamentally changed the industry. He spent his childhood and adolescence moving between the US, Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon. His mother worked for British intelligence, and his father was in the US Army counterintelligence, as well as being a founding member of the CIA. As a result, Miles' cultural awareness and global outlook have been a common theme throughout his legendary career, which has included boosting the popularity of Arab music and dance in the US market. Miles has just published a book entitled 2 Steps Forward, 1 Step Back, My Life in the Music Business, which chronicles his journey through an exceptional career and the happy accidents that unfolded along the way. Please welcome these two rock stars to the smartest people in the room. Take it away, Kelli.
Thank you, Tom. Good to be here. So for starters and for context, Miles, you and I first crossed paths, as you might recall, in the mid to late 80s when you were still running IRS records and I was a budding A&R ingenue at EMI, working with your former employee, John Guarneri, and with Neil Portnow. And of course, I've watched the evolution of your career with great enthusiasm and zeal ever since. I've always had enormous respect for you and your many accomplishments. Now, as Tom said, you've just published your memoir. And I have to say, the book was quite a compelling read, diving deep and sharing what I think is the intriguing journey of both your life and your career. And they're really intertwined in so many ways. My high-level takeaway was that you did a terrific job of sharing your wisdom and your hard-won insights and lessons throughout the book. But I'm curious if you could share with our listeners, what was your rationale to publish your memoir and why now?
Well, to be honest with you, getting locked up in Los Angeles was quite an inspiration to sitting down in that. I mean, I had nothing else to do. What am I going to do? I'm sitting here thinking, I've been told so many times, well, you got to write a book. You got to write a book. So I thought, well, here I am locked up in Los Angeles, nothing to do. So I'm going to write a book. And that's basically what I did. I wrote the book. But really, the idea of doing a memoir was not appealing in and of itself, because it kind of smacked of like, this is what I did and aren't I great? And it was a bit egotistical, really. But, I have 3 sons. So I was also very interested in the idea that I would like them to learn something from what I did, and if anybody else could learn something from it as well. So I think I was approaching it more like a motivational book or an inspirational book about, how to win even when you lose, at which of course losing was part of it, because I think I learned as many things from mistakes as I did from successes, which is why the title is 2 Steps Forward, 1 Step Back, because, no matter how smart you are, you're going to make a mistake. So, there's your 1 step back, but as long as you keep moving forward and keep being positive, you can win in the end. So, the motivation really was, number one, I was bored and nothing else to do. 2, I wanted my sons to understand what their dad did. And 3, I wanted to, sort of put forward these ideas I had that could influence anybody starting a restaurant or any other business, maybe not a doctor's office or something, where you need, medical training or whatever, but basically sort of entrepreneurial spirit, so
Yes.
That was kind of the idea.
And going for it with confidence, because you certainly have always done that.
Yeah. I mean, listening to the biog of my biog, I was thinking, boy, that guy sounds pretty good. I wonder who he is. But yeah. But the reality is that, I guess I won more times than I failed, so I guess that makes me a star,
I would say so, having tracked your career for a good chunk of it. And, also the book, it's like a marketing primer for anybody, certainly in the music space, if not other industries, in terms of being creative and innovative and just going for it. And we'll talk about some of those examples as we go.
Yeah, I've had some people actually say that to me. They said that the book was inspirational, and it, like one agent said to me, he says, this book should be given to every rock and roll star who wants to learn about the music business, because it really is a how-to almost, which
It
was
really
kind of
is.
flattering comment, which
Listen,
actually was good, because I really, like I say, I hated the idea just to making it a memoir. I wanted it to be more like, these are lessons you can learn.
Yeah, and I say we're going to touch on a bunch of those lessons and some of the case studies as we progress in our talk today, because they're just too good not to. And frankly, that's my summation of the whole book. So let's start at the start, Miles. We say you grew up in the Middle East, and obviously that had to have shaped your worldview from the get-go relative to both America and American policy, and more broadly, internationally, in a way few have experienced, frankly.
Well, it did not help me much in the music business, because let's face it, there wasn't a lot of rock and roll in Beirut, Lebanon, or Cairo, Egypt, or Damascus, Syria. But it did give me a view of the world and understanding that, there are interesting things that are happening everywhere, and that people are really not all that different, whether it be in the Middle East or the USA or whatever. And so maybe it gives you a kind of a world view. And also, I think it might have had an impact on me thinking about taking the police to India and to Egypt and some of these other places that maybe somebody growing up in the middle of America might not have ever had,
Yeah.
because
No, and of course, yeah, later in life, we'll get to that too. We're jumping ahead, but like belly dance superstars and all that, brought it full circle. I'm jumping ahead of ourselves, so I don't want to get too far out there. But clearly, you did invoke a lot of that throughout your through line of your career. And
yeah, course, I went from Beirut to London,
right?
And I was approached by a rock and roll, a band that said, who I'd helped out in Beirut, and they said, well, we think you should be a manager. And I was like, are you kidding? I don't know anything about the music business. I was studying, international politics and economics, so, but they said, well, but you got the right attitude, and I thought, well, what the hell? And it's sort of like the way I wrote the book, it's sort of like, well, what else am I going to do? So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to go and be a rock and roll manager. And the thing is that I guess I didn't know what I wasn't supposed to know. I just went and did it, because if I had been educated as to what you were, some path you were supposed to follow, I might not have succeeded. But because I didn't really know anything, I just made my own path.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I think that worked to your advantage in as we look backwards. You didn't see it at the time. So in the late 60s, this is where you were in London. And of course, it's kind of Forrest Gump-like is how I see your journey, because you were in the right place at the right time for the zeitgeist to happen, and it did. And you just sort of dove in, as you say, began booking artists and clubs, and, Ainsley Dunbar's band, who later became a notable and respected rock drummer, backing Journey and the Starship, many others, and then working with Wishbone Ash as your first managerial experience, I guess. Well, I think one of the first lessons I'd like to ask you about is to clarify what you view the role of the manager as. What are some of the most important things about a manager?
Well, I look at it from a number of standpoints, but basically it's filling in the blanks of what the band can't do themselves, because it's very hard for a band to sell themselves, just like it's hard for me as an author. It was much easier for an agent to go to a publisher and say, look, I got this great book by this Miles Copeland guy, If I went to the publisher and said, hey, I got this book and aren't I great? And it's a great book, the publisher would look at me and go like, yeah. Okay. So it's easier for an outsider to sell something. And that's part of what a manager does. A manager fills in the blanks and helps the group accomplish things that they can't do themselves. But really, if I was to be honest, I would say that really, if I looked at my role, I would call myself a door opener. I would find the door. I would open the door. I was not the person to walk through the door. It was the act that had to walk through the door. And when an act walked through the door that I opened, and they succeeded, and that was a winning formula. But there were acts that, I'd opened the door for and they wouldn't walk through. So those were failures, So really what the manager is doing is trying to find, by hook or crook, some way to move the game forward, to move the needle forward. In the case of Wishbone Ash, you know, they were brand new to the game as I was, you know, and I had to find gigs, you know, so I created a little magazine to help, you know, build some notoriety for them, you know. I found a few places that they would book them, you know. On one place, I showed up at this university and said, "Who's opening act for Ainsley Dunbar?" And they said, "Well, nobody." And I said, "Well, I've got the opening act." And they said, "Oh, okay." And so I just told the group, "Look, show up. They think you're the opening act." Of course, they weren't booked at all. So the Ainsley Dunbar people thought it was you know, the college that booked the group, and the college thought that Ainsley Dunbar booked the group. And so Wishbone Ash went on and played, and that was one of their first shows, you know. So it was basically, you know, that was the crazy thing. I mean, who would imagine you could just walk into some place and say, "Well, I've got the opening act," you know?
Yeah.
I
yeah.
didn't know that you weren't supposed to do that.
But I think, and so you learned along with the artists as part of the arc here too.
Yeah.
But I think,
and then I
Yeah.
you know, one thing after another, I made mistakes, but I would always move forward. And you know, I took them to America. I learned the ropes of going to America. And so after 3 or 4 years, I actually, you know, got to know the business reasonably well, you know.
Yeah, of course.
And that paid off when I got involved with the Punks later. But, you know,
Yeah.
it was learning by trial and error, really.
Of course. I mean, you know, you could say the same thing about George Martin and the Beatles, you know, in the experimentation that was going on in the studio. He wasn't a manager, he was the producer. But when you're playing around with new territory, uncharted territory, you learn by doing and by experimenting. And I think what you shared earlier with me when we were doing a prep for this, one of the getting through the door is certainly a piece of it. The artists have to be willing to go through the door. But another key role of manager, as I understand from your perspective, is you got to get noticed, be out in a public square. You got to stand out. You got to be, you know, it's critical to get attention and be provocative, right?
Well, you know, people say, well, the music business has changed, everything's different and all that. But it really, like you say, the first job is to get noticed. When artists come along and they'll, you know, I've had artists in the past that said, "Well, man, it's about the music, you know, it's all about the music." You know, I say, well, no, actually it's not. Music's number 2. The first thing is to get noticed.
Yes.
Because if you're not noticed and people don't know you exist, I don't care how good your music is, no one's ever going to hear it. So the first job is to get noticed, whether you paint your face and get weird like Kiss did, you know, or you wear wild clothes like Elton John, or you wiggle your hips like Elvis Presley, or you have long hair like the Beatles. But whatever you're doing, there's something about you that gets attention. You know, Alice Cooper was biting the head off of chickens. That's the first thing I heard about Alice Cooper. You know, was that something that, you know, he was all about? Was that about music? No, it was about biting the head off a chicken. That got him noticed. Then I listened to the music.
It's a good segue, Miles, to talk about, again, your early foray. We're talking pre-Police with the punk scene that was rampant in England in the early 70s and in the mid 70s and even late 70s. And I wonder, of course, there was shock value, but what was the attraction of that genre for you personally that led you to dive in?
Well, part of it was that I had just done a very disastrous, it was a great idea, perhaps, Star Trek in 75. It was like this festival tour, you know, linking all these festivals of Europe and bringing big acts together with the acts that I was managing. So, you know, conceptually, it might have been a good idea. But financially, it was a complete disaster because one mistake and the whole thing began. It's like a deck of cards, you know, what you pull one card out and the whole thing, the deck isn't worth anything. It was like a domino. So I ended up by the end of Star Trekking completely flat broke. You know, I had not a penny to my name. You know, I almost went bankrupt. And a lot of the bands and a lot of the people in the business that I had known sort of wrote me off and said, well, Miles Copeland's over. A lot of the bands just left. They said, well, he didn't have any money anymore, so to hell with him, you know. So I was left with nothing, basically. Meanwhile, the punks that everybody was assumed was some sort of musical forum I realized it was really a generational change. They were looking for their own heroes. They wanted to wear their own kind of clothes. They wanted to, it was a generational change, not a musical form really. And nobody paid attention to them. So I figured, well, I'll pay attention to them. And the good thing about the punks is they didn't care that I didn't have any money. But the fact that I paid attention to them, they did care about. So I found myself gravitating to the one group of people who would pay attention to me because I was paying attention to them. And that was the punks.
Yeah. And again, you and they both were sort of, residents of the island of misfit toys.
We were both outcasts from the music business. And that, in a way, that was exciting because it made us like revolutionaries. We were challenging the system. And as the Sex Pistols said, they wrote off all the previous groups, including Wishbone Ash, by the way, as old farts. They're old farts. And I thought that was kind of fun because as far as I was concerned, all the old farts had left me too. So I was perfectly happy to throw my lot in with the punks and call all those Led Zeppelins and all those people old farts because they had left me too. So I was very happy to, fall in line with the punks.
It's very interesting. And of course, that's a natural segue in a sense to the Police. It's interesting that Stewart saw the Police as a punk band, or when the other guys didn't. And I'm not sure most would have slanted them into that genre. I sure didn't when I first heard them. But let's talk about how you wound up managing them and that segue into the Police era.
Well, Stewart was my younger brother, and I had put him in Curved Air, which was a progressive rock band. And one of the disasters of the Star Trekking tour was me running out of money meant eventually Curved Air sort of ground to a halt as well. So Stewart got quite excited about the punk thing, just as I did. And what excited him about it was that it was, you don't have to be great musicians. You don't have to have a lot of equipment. You don't have to have an entourage of roadies. And it's basically thumbing your nose at the whole establishment. That was quite exciting. So Stewart decided, well, a 3-piece group cut down to the bone, just a few bits of equipment, one roadie. That's a band that he can control, and so he formed the Police. And he talked Sting into joining. Of course, Sting was from a jazz group and really didn't like punk, to tell you the truth. And Andy Summers eventually joined, who was also from Soft Machine, who really hated punk because they couldn't play instruments the same way he could, But Stewart liked the energy of the punk thing. And Andy and Sting both liked the energy of it and the sort of thumbing your nose at the establishment because the establishment wasn't really accepting them either, Yeah. So, I at one point suggested we go record an album, and we did. And I was expecting a punk album, kind of raucous and, a lot of angry political lyrics and all that sort of thing, which was really not what the Police were all about, So I go to the studio and they play me the album, and I'm listening for what I thought was a punk band. And of course, I was not really hearing, something that would qualify as being punk. So therefore I knew it would be difficult to sell. And finally there was one more song to play. And they said, well, don't play him that song. Don't play him that song. And well, why? Well, because it's a ballad and it's a love song and you're going to hate it. And I said, but I've come all the way here. Let me hear the damn song. And they said, no, you can't hear the song. And finally the engineer got tired of us arguing about whether you're going to play the song or not. And he just stuck it on. And of course, the group, all lowered their head, waiting for me to start yelling at them, saying, what kind of crap is this? When I looked at them, I said, gentlemen, this is a classic. This song is going to change our lives. And they looked at me like I had two heads. And they said, what? You like that song? And I'm sure back in Sting's head, he was thinking, boy, if he likes that song, I got some more coming. He's Walking on the Moon, and all those sort of songs that Every Breath You Take and all these other things were back in his mind, So Roxanne was really the most honest Police song. And the minute I heard that song, I realized that they were really a transition between and they had the energy of punk, but they had the musicianship that would work on a broader scale. So I went to A&M Records and talked them into a record deal. which eventually meant we went to America, and the American company eventually woke up to the fact that there's this band that they had that was actually working and getting radio play. And that was the start of the Police.
Well, let's step one step back on that statement, Miles, and go to that fateful show in Northern New York when only 4 people showed up, but it turned out one of the 4 was very pivotal. I'll let you tell the rest of the story.
Well, the reality was that we couldn't get, as it was said in the papers, we couldn't get arrested in England. The police couldn't get arrested. So I decided, my brother Ian was booking at an agency in Macon, Georgia. And I called him up and I said, Ian, can you book the Police into America? And he said, Miles, there's no record company here. There's no record. It's unheard of for a British group to tour America with no support. And I said, yeah, but can you do it? And he says, well, I'm going to play you in every dive and crap club there is on the East Coast. And I said, I don't care what it is. Just get us to America, and luckily the Laker Airways had a cheap airfare for like 75 pounds. You could fly to New York, So I took the Police to America basically because it was fresh territory and they would not be looked upon as phony punks, So the first gig was at CBG. They went down very well. They played the Rat Club in Boston and all these other places. But most of the places they played, not many people showed up. And they played one show in Northern New York where only 4 people showed up. And I've been asked many times, what was the most important gig of your career? And people would imagine I would say like Shea Stadium, with 80,000 people and all this, And I'd say, well, no, actually the most important gig was one that the Police played in Northern New York where there were 4 people in the audience. And the group walks out and says, these are 4 people that actually bought tickets for this unknown group on their first tour of America that has no business being in America. So let's give them a hell of a show. And they went out and they played and did a hell of a show. One of those 4 people was a DJ called Oedipus at an MIT University in Boston who had his own punk show. They gave him the Roxanne single. He goes back to Boston, starts banging that single. Next thing you know, it's a regional hit, and BCN and other stations pick up on it, and it shows up in the Billboard radio charts, where the M of A&M Records, Jerry Moss, sees it and calls me up one day. He got my phone number from A&M in London and said, Miles, this is Jerry Moss. I see the Police are on the radio charts. Is this my band in America? I said, yes, it is. And he said, well, we better do something. I said, yeah, you better. He says, get the band back over here. Let's work the record. I said, okay. My next call was to Ian. I said, Ian, book us another tour. We got support from a record company. And that was the start of the Police. So it was me choosing Roxanne and Oedipus playing the song that actually with the ingredients that made the machine start working for us and got the ball rolling.
Isn't hindsight wonderful when you look over your shoulder?
It just goes to show that, you can't, and that's one of the lessons, that, you walk out and there's only 4 people, sometimes it only takes one person to change the game.
That's right.
And so never be too proud when you walk out and there aren't that many people in the room. You never know what that one person just might be the person to change the game. So do your best all the time. And that was one of the lessons that I learned. The other lesson, of course, was getting the Police the record deal in the first place.
Yeah.
Because, in England, I heard Roxanne, and I knew that was a great song, but the reality was there was no press on the Police. There was no tour. There was no fan base. There was absolutely nothing to recommend the group.
And so without radio airplay, what were you going to do? Yeah,
basically all the criteria that you would need for a record company, you'd walk in and you would say, I got this great band and, I got all these good things happening and, I want a lot of money and, all that. So I went in and I said, look, I had none of those things. So I said, look, here's the deal. The band's yours. It's free. No risk. It's yours. The record's yours. Now, listen to the music. And I'll bet you it's the only time that A&R person ever listened to the music without thinking, is this going to cost my job? What's this? Is this going to make me, is this going to eat up my budget for the year? What's my boss going to say if I fail? He just thought, well, gee, I like the record. It sounds really good. How bad could it be? It's free.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we got the deal. And all of a sudden the police were on A&M Records.
And of course, they rose to fame fairly quickly and to the top of the charts. But one thing I want to segue to is the impact of MTV, which came a few years later, on fanning the flame of their popularity. Could they have blown up as much without that fuel that was MTV?
Well, they were happening before MTV. MTV helped take it over the top.
Yeah.
But I would say if I looked at the bands that were probably most affected positively by MTV, it would have been the Go-Go's and IRS Records, because the police were already sort of on the way when MTV launched. And I recognized that MTV was an important player, which is why the police and I flew our lot in with MTV. We were the first to sponsor a tour with MTV. We gave all our videos to them for free. We were very happy to have the support of MTV, largely because a lot of other people turned their noses up and wouldn't help MTV. And we said, well, you'll play our stuff? Great, you're our friend. So we gave them everything.
And it went into heavy rotation as a result.
Yeah, and of course, then when the Go-Go's came along and their video immediately went into rotation, and Walla Voodoo and all the rest of them. So we were, and actually I started my own my own TV show on MTV called The Cutting Edge, which lasted for 5 years. We were the only record company ever to have its own TV show on MTV, because we recognized that MTV was, well, they accepted us. It was sort of like the same reason why the punks were cool for me, is that they accepted me. When everybody else wrote me off, the punks were happy to say, we'll take your phone call. MTV was very happy that we would be willing to give them videos and be supportive. And the police said, sure, we'll support you on our tour, and we'll be the sponsor for MTV, etc.
Once again,
and the famous, I want my MTV.
Yep.
The police were the first band to do it. So literally it was find support wherever it was and use that as a vehicle to build momentum. Because in the beginning, remember, MTV was not particularly important. No, and a lot of the record companies and a lot of the acts refused to give them product.
Exactly.
We said, sure, we'll give you product. We were happy to.
And then one hand washed the other ongoing. When Sting later on, I Want My MTV in the Talking Heads song, in a way, MTV couldn't have bought that kind of publicity, right?
Yeah, I think, one of the lessons of the book is, and one of the lessons of my successes were that really it's the small things sometimes the things you don't look particularly important in the beginning, but they can become important. But if somebody is positively supporting you, that's in a way already a stepping stone. And even if it's a small stepping stone, at least it's a stepping stone.
Yep.
And from one stepping stone goes to another, to another, to another. And I think that was really the lesson of the police. We went from small beginnings to bigger, to bigger, to bigger, and the same with MTV.
Well, I have one last police question, then we're going to move on. And that is, you alluded to it earlier, your experience in taking the police to breaking new international territories that really hadn't had exposure to much in the way of Western acts. You were first in places like India, Egypt, Greece, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and more, literally some police states at the time, where you had groundbreaking challenges and learning. So talk about the impact of reaching those audiences and what you learned.
Well, part of it was the idea that, when I imagined, with the old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And of course, part of my job as a manager was opening doors and creating notoriety and getting noticed, So I figured a picture of Sting riding an Arab stallion dressed up like Lawrence of Arabia with the pyramids in the background, that would be a photo that would get into the newspapers,
Yes.
And the police on camels in Cairo, and the police dressed up as Maharajas at the Taj Mahal Hotel in India, And of course, I was right. The playing these wild places caused attention, because if you're sitting there and you're a journalist and you're looking at one photo and after another and another interview with some pretentious rock band, and along comes a photograph of 3 guys riding camels in Egypt, you're thinking, wow, that's an interesting story. And all of a sudden that becomes your front page. So in a way, that was part of it. But the other part of it was that recognition that there is a world out there, and that people in Latin America buy records too, and the police, I think they were big worldwide because we thought worldwide.
Yep. Yep. So now we move on to the formation of both IRS records, which you ran with Jay Boberg as president, while you focused more on the management.
No,
of the
that's
act.
not true. Jay
Help
Boberg
me
was vice
fix that.
president. Jay Broberg was vice president. I started
Okay.
the label. I hired him because I knew I was flitting back and forth between England and America. I was being pressured by my groups in England that I had put out independent singles, just like I did with the police. So I went to Jerry Moss and said, look, I want to start a label here. And I used the same technique as I did with the police. And I said, look, I don't need your money because I already had these records recorded in England, and I said, I don't need your money. I just need you to put the records out. And then I thought, well, I need somebody in LA to sort of stay on top of things. So I went to the college guys, these young kids basically who were still in college. Jay Boberg was in college, and I said, look, I can't pay a lot. I paid him $100 a week, but I'll make you vice president of a label. And I guess that sounded pretty good to a kid in college, So the title worked. He wasn't president until we sold to EMI 10 years later. And then I kicked myself up to become chairman of the board, and I made him president of the label. But
Right.
Basically, I built the IRS by hiring people from the college department, Michael Plen, and later others that we took out of the college department that A&M stupidly fired, basically.
Right.
About a month after I started the label, they fired the college department, and which gave me opportunities to hire these young kids who were into what I was doing. And
Right.
Jay became an important part of the label, as did Michael Plen and Barbara Boland and a lot of the other people. So IRS became quite good at not only signing acts, but also finding young talent to be executives and to help promote. So I think the legacy of IRS was not just the acts, but it was also sort of fueling and funneling new talent into the record business.
Yeah, so I've got a quick detour question before we dive into the expansion of the roster of some of those artists on IRS, which is the success you had with Squeeze and the police obviously led to creating that pivotal relationship with Jerry Moss and A&M. And I'd love for you to talk about his influence and impact as a partner to you at that point. And there's a lesson in there that we've touched on previously about making yes an easy answer and eliminating risk.
Well, the thing about Jerry Moss that was interesting was that he was essentially a music guy. Remember, he was a manager as well. He was managing Herb Alpert.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a label in which, he was a manager and Herb was the musician. So it was sort of like me and the police in a way. And I think he saw in me what he saw in himself in the beginning days of A&M Records. If I because he and I became good friends, and I have a lot of belief in Jerry Moss. He's one of the good guys of the record business. And but I learned, with the police deal, make the answer yes easy, which was say it's free, which was the same strategy I used with Jerry Moss. He had suggested, well, let me hear the records. And I said, well, I'm not going to ask for your money, but you can't hear the music. So, because I knew if he'd listened to the music, being a music guy, he would reject it.
Yeah.
So he said, well, I guess, he's figuring, well, how bad could it be? It's free. What the hell? So, but after a year, he called me into his office and he said, well, you put out 8 records and no, you haven't had a hit. So, let's end the label. I said, yeah, but Jerry, every act has only put out the first record, yet you made money over the year. And he said, yeah, but we didn't make a lot, And I said, yeah, but how many times in your career have you made money in the first year of a relationship? He said, well, never. And I said, yeah, but you did with me. He says, yeah, but it wasn't a lot. I said, yeah, but you made something. And he said, yeah, you're right. I'll give you another year. And of course, by the end of the second year, I think he sort of forgot that he'd only given us another year. And then, of course, the Go-Go's happened. And of course, then everything changed. And they went to #1. And, IRS became a real thing at that point. Everybody woke up to the fact that we were not some cute little label that was signing all these misfits and strange acts. We were actually a winning label.
I'm going to want to talk about some of those artists in a moment, but somebody's asked us a question about the origin of why you called it IRS.
Well, Stewart, my father was obviously CIA. Stewart
Yeah.
called the band the Police because, somebody asked him once, why did you call the band the Police? And he said, well, because there are cars all around the world with my name of my band written on the front of their car and on the side, which is
Typical
kind
Stewart.
of a cool idea. And
Yeah.
then when Ian decided he would, form an agency, the word FBI sort of seemed like the obvious thing. The FBI booking the police, my father in the CIA. So when it came to forming a record company, I thought, well, International Record Syndicate, the IRS,
And
so we had a
FBI, of
motto,
course,
the
Frontier
IRS
Booking.
you want to hear from. So in a
Yeah.
way, it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek,
Yes.
thumb in it. It was like establishment, but yet we were anti-establishment. So it was kind of a thumb in the nose of the establishment.
And Frontier Booking International FBI. It was, of course,
Yeah.
Ian. So very good. Well, let's talk about the IRS roster a little bit, which of course was Squeeze, which went to A&M, right?
Yeah, Squeeze was at A&M, although I
Yeah.
did put out a couple of things on IRS, but Squeeze was the first signing I had at A&M Records.
And Police, again, A&M. The Go-Go's, Oingo Boingo, the Bangles, Fine Young Cannibals, Concrete Blonde, and even REM early on, which I would like you to dive into a little bit more because there's a big lesson there. But you were riding the wave of huge success with those artists during the heyday of IRS. And I wonder if you were surprised at the level of success that you reached. I know you worked hard for it, but how much was luck and timing that played into some of that?
Well, I think luck and timing is always, in a sense, something that's there, But like they say, the more you keep at something, the more chance luck has to happen, for you, So
Yeah.
if you keep at something, and eventually luck will come to play, But I think IRS was lucky in some ways. We were unlucky in others. Most of the bands, I think REM, for instance, was the only act to fulfill their contract and do all the albums in the contract. The Go-Go's broke up after the third album. The Fine Young Cannibals broke up after the second album. General Public after the second. A lot of the bands didn't make it beyond album 2. Some acts never beyond album 1. Which was the sort of the one of the tragedies of the music business. And in a way, IRS, suffered for that because a lot of the acts, and terminated before their time, really,
Exactly.
REM did not, as it happens, which is, one has to, give kudos to them for sticking it out and getting all the way to the end,
Well,
So,
yeah, I want to
but
talk
go
about
ahead, you had a
REM
question?
specifically in a minute, but I just wanted to get your read on were you surprised at the level of success that you reached? Because you really did hit it big.
Well, I didn't really, I was putting out records, I was kind of surprised, what was surprising me most was the fact that I would go to a concert like the Go-Go's, for instance. I would be the only person that could sign an act in the room.
Yeah.
The one, a single A&R person anywhere to be seen. I was the only one, and I'm looking at it thinking, well, there's 5 girls on stage. They're engaging. They've got great songs. How bad could it be? What a great gimmick. 5 girls to write their own music. I thought, well, this is easily marketable. But apparently all the labels rejected them because they were girls. And the Go-Go's once said to me, he says, well, the reason everybody wouldn't sign us is because we were girls, And I thought, well, but that's why I signed you in a way. It was because you were special, And the Bangles was the same thing. They were special too. Not because they were all girls necessarily, but there was this, they had good songs and just so happened they were girls, it gave them a certain charm,
Now, because both bands, Miles, were 5 girls in bands, some people tend to lump them into a similar category at first blush, but of course they were very different. What were some of the distinctions between them that really supported their success and ultimate demise?
Well, the Go-Go's really, they were more integral in a sense. They wrote all their songs. They played all the instruments and all that. The Go-Go's were a bit more influenced by a producer. They would do songs like, Prince wrote a song for the Bangles. Okay.
Right.
So, Manic Monday was
Monday.
written by Prince, which was their first hit,
Right.
Walk Like an Egyptian was not written by them, So, Eternal Flame, they partly wrote, So they were more open to, let's say, influence from other songwriters. Also, they had a different policy in terms of, in the case of the Go-Go's, they were very happy to see Belinda be on the front cover, of a magazine. They figured, well, same as the Police. If Sting was on the front cover, they figured, well, that's good publicity for the band. The Bangles were very concerned that nobody is singled out. So you had to have 4 spotlights on stage or none. You had to have a photograph of all 4 of them or none. So we lost a lot of front covers because some magazines wanted to just have one person.
Right.
They would say, well, we've got a front cover for Susanna Hoffs.
Yeah.
Sorry, we can't do it. So we were turning down a lot more. And that was one of the big differences. But the fact that they were both sort of from the punk environment, they both came from LA. They were all women. People naturally sort of assumed that they were similar. But really, when you think about it, you think, well, there are a lot of bands from LA that were all men. Nobody lumped them together. Why the Bangles and the Go-Go's lumped together? It's just that they were a bit more unique. It
Right.
was a bit more unique that you would have an all-girl band, But I think both the Bangles and the Go-Go's kind of opened the door for women.
Yes.
In ways that I think have become very important.
Agreed. Now, I do want to talk about REM for a minute, because that one was special in terms of what went down and the whole situation with Warner. And there's a lesson in there. So do you want to talk about that a little more detail?
Well, I in the very beginning, my brother Ian pushed me to sign the REM, and Jay Boberg had also gone to see them, and he quite liked them as well. And so we signed REM. In the beginning, and the Police, frankly, I mean, we thought they were a little bit on the boring side, They wouldn't even appear in their own videos. But as time went on, they became more and more, one couldn't help but recognize the fact that they were growing, and every album sold more than the last. And eventually, the last album of the contract was reached, and they sold almost 2 million copies. And at the end, the manager and the lawyer came to see me, and they said, well, look, we'd love to re-sign with IRS Records, but we think we owe it to ourselves to go to the open market and see what the market will bear. And if you give us the best deal, we'll sign with IRS. And I thought, well, that's very fair. They were really great people. REM were always great, and they would never caused a problem, which meant that Jay Boberg spent more time with them than I did, because there were never issues that dragged me into it,
Right.
Like most of the other groups, I got dragged into some problem, But anyway, so we ended up offering, the money kept climbing, and finally it's between A&M and Warner Brothers. And I went to Jerry Moss and said, I need more money. And he says, well, I'll throw in $3 million. And then the group came back to see me and said, look, I don't know how to tell you this, but here's the deal from Warner Brothers. And it said, whatever Miles offers you, we'll double it. And at that, I knew the game was over.
Yeah.
There was no way I was going to compete. And I actually stood up and said to the manager and the lawyer, I said, look, here's my advice. Get out of my damn office, go straight to Warner Brothers, sign that deal. It's the best deal I ever saw. Congratulations. Get there before they change their mind.
Yes.
And they did. They went to Warner Brothers, signed the deal. And of course, the next record was huge. And they ended up making probably the best record deal ever made.
So the lesson there, do what's right for the artist.
Yeah, well, they kind of broke. I mean, I had a lawyer whose idea was always, look, once you get a bit of success, go renegotiate the deal, get more money. And if you have to give another record at the end of the deal, do it. Just get more money. It's all about the money. Actually, he had a motto. It's not about the money. It's about the money. REM had a different motto. Their motto was, well, we don't care about it. We'll stick with the contract. We don't give any more records away. We don't need any more advance. We don't need any more royalty. We'll just fulfill the contract like it's written. And at the end, we'll go to the market and see who's offering the most. Well, I would wager to say that the REM deal in that case ended up being better than the police deal, because they ended up getting a huge deal from Warner Brothers. And of course, the police ended up doing very well as well, because, after the first album, of course, when they were successful, the lawyers, we go in and we renegotiate. Just like the Go-Go's did after the first album went to #1, their lawyer marches in the office and saying, we're going to renegotiate. We're going to hit a group now. We want more money. We want more royalty. We said, sure. And what did I do? I gave them, they gave me a couple more records, which I never got, by the way, of course, because they broke up after the third album.
Right.
But I gave them more royalty, and, it's all fine,
But luckily, REM.
So the game really is, what's the smart move?
Exactly
Go
right.
for the money today or wait till the end? And really, the answer is really depends on how your level of success. If you're only going to make it through two records, take the money. If you're going to stick it out all the way to the end, well, maybe the REM deal is the much better deal.
And the other lesson is that, Bertus Downs, of course, was the manager/lawyer for REM, still is, if you want to say that, because the band's not really active right now. But hire really smart people. If you're an artist, be sure you're surrounded by a great manager and lawyer, which are usually two different people. So let's move on about Duran Duran. That's the last piece I want to talk about with artists. And I really want to hit a few other key points before we wrap up, Miles. So Duran Duran, it was what I would consider a cautionary tale in terms of their expectations being out of sync with reality. And, your mantra, tell people, they wanted people to tell them what they wanted to hear, as opposed to what you did, which was to tell them the truth about what they needed to hear, which they didn't like.
Well, I learned early on that, one of the necessary attributes that a manager has to have is the ability to lie just a little bit, but I have to admit, I was not a very good liar. And there were artists that I should have managed or would have managed, but I couldn't just tell them a lie. They would come to me and they'd say, this is the single. And I would say, well, actually, it's not. And they didn't want to hear that. And then, of course, I wouldn't make it as the manager. But in the case of Duran Duran, I was really excited about taking on Duran Duran. And actually, we signed a contract. I actually was the official manager of Duran Duran with a signed contract. And to celebrate, we all went out to dinner. And they were, I knew what the question was going to be. They were going to say, well, now this was the original 5 members of Duran Duran reformed. Well, earlier that day, I had been to the prospective record company that would most likely sign them, which was EMI. And I said, well, what would you pay for the reformed Duran Duran with the 5 original members? And they said, well, actually, probably not much more than we paid for the last record, which was 3 original members. Because really the market doesn't care unless there's a really big hit single. And they said, well, maybe we'd pay £500,000, and I thought, well, if I tell the group that, they're going to freak, So I go to the dinner and I'm thinking to myself, this time I've got to lie. I've got to lie bigger than I've ever lied before. And I'm going to make up some number, which is completely nonsense. But I'm going to have to lie because I can't tell them the truth. If I tell them the truth, they're going to throw me out, Yeah. So they, at the dinner, then finally one of them says, well, Miles, what do you think the record deal is going to be? So I said, well, guys, I think we can get £2 million. And I bit my tongue as I said it, because I knew the chances of £2 million was 0. We were lucky if we'd get £1 million, The silence descended on the dinner. And at the end, I thought, well, maybe they saw through my lie, and they realized that I was just a bullshitter, So I kind of went home and it was kind of, well, hopefully they'll forget about it. Next morning, the lawyer calls me up and says, Miles, got bad news. What's that? The group thinks you're the wrong manager. And I said, well, oh, so they saw through my lie, did they? And he said, no. I said, what do you mean? No. He said, well, they were expecting a much larger number. I said, what, more than 2 million pounds? He said, yeah, they were expecting 5 million pounds. I said, you're out of your fucking mind. There's no way they're going to make 5 million pounds. He says, I know. But that's not what they wanted to hear.
So the lesson there.
So I said, well, get the group together again. Let's have a meeting. So we go to the meeting, and they had already made up their mind. I walked into the meeting and I said, guys, look, if you can find a manager who can get you 5 million pounds, make the deal. I'll tell you what, I brought the contract with me. I'll tear it up right now. I took it out and I ripped it in half. And that was I managed Duran Duran for the grand total of, I think, a couple of weeks.
But again, the lesson there is really, you may be the only person who tells the truth, and you've got to do it regardless of the consequences. It's the right thing to do.
Well, I think a lot of artists want to hear a lie, and I will admit that I was not a particularly good liar, I think some managers have done pretty well by being able to, lie to their artists, tell them what they want to hear, but I was not particularly good at that. So I'd say that's that I would consider that one of my failings, is that I was not a very good liar.
I don't.
If I had been a good liar, I'd be managing Duran Duran to this day.
Yeah, it's okay, Miles. All respect to the person that you are. Tom,
but I would say this: Sting, for instance.
Yeah.
Sting wanted the truth, and that's why I always respected him.
Yep.
Is because he said, "Look, just tell me the truth." And when I did tell him the truth, and it was not what he wanted to hear, he would say, "Well, I will pay the price of it." And I knew that he was one of those artists that would pay the price, and he wouldn't blame me if it didn't work. So when there were artists who would listen and who wanted the truth, Jules Holland was another one, in Squeeze, and those were the artists that I did best with, the ones that were prepared to listen, and were prepared to face the truth when it was told to them.
Tom, we're probably going to need a few minutes. We're going to run a little bit long. I'm hoping that's going to be okay. Thank you. I know you're okay with that, Miles. So Miles, we didn't talk much about Sting, and obviously everybody would have expected us to do that. But here's where I think we really should, and you can embellish beyond that with your relationship if you'd like. But I want to touch on one of the pivotal promotional strategies that you're most famous for quarterbacking and architecting for your artists. The obvious one being the JAG ad / music video for Sting with Desert Rose. And, let's talk about what you did with that in a nutshell that made it such a powerful example for somebody to follow.
Well, let's remember is that for many, many years, it has been suggested that it is selling out if you give your song to a commercial.
Yep.
Especially from a new album,
Mm-hmm.
So Levi's and various other companies had used songs, but they were usually old songs that had, passed their prime, and the artist was, happy to make the money. But it was very rare for an artist with a new album to let their song be used in a commercial.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Desert Rose was a song that Sting believed in and I believed in, and we thought that was a strong single. But the American record company said, well, no, it's not a single because we don't know who this Shep Mami guy is, and it's different. And even though they admitted that their favorite song on the record was Desert Rose, but it was not a single. So they refused to put it out.
And they were afraid of the Middle Eastern influence of Shep Mami.
They were afraid of Middle Eastern, and they were afraid that it starts with that. They didn't understand, they started with this Arab voice, they were like, but the Europeans were not so precious about it. They said, well, we think it's good, so we'll put it out in Europe, but we need a video. So we got a small budget from A&M, and they said, well, okay, make a video for Europe. And so the video was this silly video of, a Jaguar car with Sting and Shep Mami in the car driving from LA to Las Vegas. It was that silly, it was no big deal video. But when the video comes in and I'm looking at it and Sting's looking at it with all the entourage, and we're saying, well, I'm looking at it thinking, my God, that's a good looking car. My God, we have made a car commercial. And I figured, well, the next day I'm going to call up Jaguar and see if I can get some kind of association. So I called up Jaguar. Well, actually, it was Ogilvy and Mather, was the advertising agency, and said, I've just done a video for your car with Sting's music from his new album. And they thought, of course, this is some crazy guy, you know. But I said, well, let me send you the video. So I sent them the video. And a couple of days later, I get this very reverential Ogilvy and Mather advertising executive. Mr. Copeland. Oh, yes, we've seen the video. And what can we do? I said, okay, look, I've just sold your car. Now help me sell the record, you know. And if you make the commercial look like it's an ad for Sting's record, I'll give it to you for free. Well, they did. And then I went to the record company and I said, okay, I've just given the Sting video to Jaguar to promote Desert Rose. And I said, you're out of your mind. You're supposed to get money. I said, I gave it to him for free. And they said, you're crazy. And I said, okay. And I had with me the advertising budget that Jaguar had given me that they were going to spend on Desert Rose. And I threw it down on the desk of the executive. And I said, okay, if you'll spend that money, I'll go to Jaguar for an advance. It was $18 million of TV advertising, including the Super Bowl. They looked down there. It was the biggest advertising budget ever spent on any single ever in the entire American record business, as to this day. And $18 million was spent. Little did I know that Jaguar's problem was not just selling cars. Their problem was that the Jaguar was considered an old person's car. And the average age of the buyer was over 65. And they were figuring, well, in 10 years, we're not going to have a market because all our buyers will be dead. So they needed to lower the age group of the buyer to 40 to 45, as well as sell cars. Well, needless to say, that Jaguar commercial made Jaguar hip, and the age group of the average buyer of Jaguar cars dropped to 45. So it's been the most successful tie-in forever in the music, between the music business and a product. And the reason it worked was really this, is that the Jaguar car was cool.
Yeah.
And there was never any problem with, selling out if the product was cool, but if you sold out, if it was Tampax or it was, some kind of, wiffle midget that was silly, of course it would demean the song, but the Jaguar car was cool,
Yeah.
So it associated the song with something cool, and that worked. And after that happened, and other artists woke up to the fact that, well, maybe it isn't selling out. So all of a sudden you saw the Rolling Stones and Celine Dion and others begin to let their songs be used as commercials.
Yeah.
Because frankly, Jaguar and some of these companies have more money to spend than the record company, because A&M Records, the entire budget of A&M Records to spend on the Sting record was $1.8 million versus 18 million TV advertising alone on Desert Rose. It's
a fantastic marketing case study. Now, we do have a question about Sting from our listeners. Marty Simon says, I went to see a movie, Outland, with Sean Connery with Sting in Montreal in '81 and spoke to him about acting. Why is it Sting and Mick Jagger or other other artists have not succeeded in film? Did Miles promote or discourage that path for Sting in any way?
I did not play any role in that. I let Sting do what he wanted to do. He had an agent, and I kind of stayed out of the film thing. Films have always been very difficult. I was offered, Robert Downey Jr. took me to lunch one day and said, look, you should be my manager. I'm a musician, And of course, he gets so much money from film. Why would he ever want to waste his time playing in clubs, So of course, nothing ever happened. I worked with Daryl Hannah, same story. Beverly D'Angelo, a lot of sort of movie stars. So I saw that side. The only guy that actually did anything was Steven Seagal. Actually,
well,
he just said, "Look,
Kevin Costner." It could be argued.
Okay. Anyway, so it's very rare. Frank Sinatra managed to pull it off. Okay.
Yeah.
Elvis, I guess in a way did,
Mm-hmm.
but it's been difficult for music stars to pull it off the other way, because people have associated them so much with their music that they're not really accepted as an actor. And it's just one of those sort of strange phenomena that, is there a good reason for it? Well, not really. I mean, some musicians have actually managed to do it,
Yeah.
But it seems to me relatively rare.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to some more contemporary stuff, a little bit of Back to the Future and stuff. From IRS days, you did launch another label, Art 21, and the Belly Dance Superstars, which of course had you bring your roots from the Middle East full circle. And being that, you being the through line, that personified Middle Eastern music. I mean, Stewart did infusing, the influences of the Middle East and reggae and punk into the music and the drumming. But you did it in terms of working with some of these artists and crossing cultural divides.
Well, that really sprung from Desert Rose, because what happened was that Arab artists began to hear that I was interested in Sheb Mami and this Algerian and the mixture of Western and Arabic music. And so I was approached by a lot of artists, and I started putting out a lot of Middle Eastern music, again, because no one would release the records in America, and I got them for free, basically. So my view was, well, how bad could it be? I like the music, and all I need to do is find an audience. Well, the funny thing was that the audience turned out to be American women who were belly dancers, who were dancing for health and exercise and whatever, And I thought, well, that would be an interesting thing. So I decided to create a river dance style show with belly dance as the form, and that would help me sell the records. And we created this show, which was competitive with Riverdance. We did 800 shows in 25 countries. Unfortunately, the audience never was big enough, but it did get the attention of the Pentagon because I became an expert on, Arabic music. And so when the Pentagon was interested in winning hearts and minds in the Middle East, and they called up the Recording Institute of America and said, is there any American that knows a damn thing about Arabic music? And the answer was, well, there's only one, and it's this Miles Copeland guy. So I get a phone call from Donald Rumsfeld's office. And next thing I know, I'm invited to the Pentagon to advise them how to win hearts and minds in the Middle East, which I did.
I tell you, Miles, it's Forrest Gump all over the place. A couple last things I want to touch on that I think are pretty important. And that one of them, of course, is working with your two brothers, with Ian and Stuart. And obviously, they're both extremely talented in their own right. God rest his soul, Ian. We've lost Ian, RIP. But what are highlights that you want to say about working with them? And I'm determined.
I would say there were two aspects.
Yeah.
Number one is that we were each in a non-competitive field. Stuart was a musician. I was not.
Yeah.
Ian was the agent. I had done some agent work, but Ian was particularly good at. He was a great character, which is really helpful for an agent. Okay. And I was a very good methodical manager at record company, this and that. So we were in different fields, but I had brought each of them into the business, but I was never into nepotism. So it was really a situation where, look, I'll open the door, but you've got to walk through the door. And once you're through, I'm not going to back you just because you're my brother,
Right.
So that was understood from the very beginning, because I think if I had done that and I had backed them simply because they were my brothers, it wouldn't have been real. But they just happened to be very good at what they did. And that was again, one of the kind of mystiques, I guess, of, the Police were three guys and there was the three brothers. And that was sort of part of the mystique of, the Copeland brother thing and all that, which is kind of fun, but it was just lucky.
Plus, I'm determined to keep memory alive, as I've shared with you. I'm going to leave the part about your dad and the CIA alone, because you talk about it quite a bit in the book and we're just running out of time, but that's a very important piece and an incentive for the folks that are watching to read the book, because it's really quite pivotal with him having been a founding member of the CIA and that influence on you. What I do want to talk about briefly before we wrap up is where you're sitting, which is your castle in France, Chateau Marouat, which you bought about 30 years ago. And tell us a little bit about what led to that and what you've done with it relative to these fabulous songwriter retreats.
Well, it was another one. I just sold the record company and I had money in the bank, which was probably a mistake. And I just happened to come across this property and I thought, well, it would make a great place to invite songwriters to write songs, because there's something magical. People imagine, a castle, if you have, Henry Potter, it takes place in a castle. It's a lot of the the Knights of the Round Table and all this good stuff. So I figured, a castle in France, how bad could it be? It would be a good place for songwriters. And I just, like, almost as a whim, I bought the castle. And I then thought, well, what the hell have I done? I bought a castle in France. What a crazy thing to do. And then I thought, well, I'll actually invite songwriters and see if it works. And of course it did. We ended up with writing 4 number ones. People like Keith Urban came here, met the Go-Go's, wrote the hit song that went to number 1. I've had everybody from, Ted Nugent came, gave me his bow and arrow. John Bon Jovi gave me a guitar. Cher came, gave me a mace. Carole King has been 3 times. Actually, I knighted her because she wrote a song here that Celine Dion cut, which sold 35 million copies. So yeah, it's been successful. So it's sort of one of those fun things I did. Again, almost like a what the hell moment. But then I had to figure out, well, how the hell do I validate this crazy idea? And the songwriting events did that.
Well, there's more about the chateau and the castle in the book. So again, read the book to learn more. I think finally what I want to say, 2 last things. What are you working on right now, Miles, that excites you? What's coming up next?
Well, I'm working with Steve Vai. I do a guitar tour with him and a bunch of other guitar players. I like to work with musicians. And I'm working with a guy that's we're working on a David Bowie tribute show. We're looking to work with Kenny Wade Shepherd with kind of a blues package. So I really look for like concept things that lead to a brand or whatever, and I'm not actively looking for managing acts or, I'm not signing records anymore. So it's really, I don't have any particular rule other than if I get excited about something, I'll do it. If I don't, well, why bother,
Another wise lesson, and many that we've talked about today. I think the last thing I want to wrap up by asking is, so many things have happened throughout this incredible career and your life, some of which are happy accidents. If they hadn't happened, the next dominoes might not have fallen throughout your journey. Is there anything that you regret that didn't happen or that you haven't done as you look backwards?
Well, I think it's kind of a mistake to, dwell on, mistakes, but, I mean, there are things that I wish had gone differently. I would have been happier if Stan Ridgway had carried on with Walla Voodoo to let Mexican radio rise in the charts as much as it could.
Yeah.
I would have been happier if Pat McDonald and Timbuktu had accepted the $3 million we were offered for The Future So Bright I Gotta Wear Shades. I would have been happier if I continued to manage Duran Duran, but I think a lot of these things were interesting events along the way, and they each give lessons. I did Steven Seagal as a lark in a way, and I only worked with him for 6 months, but there's some funny stories there, and actually it's very interesting, working with a guy like that. There was a group called the Genitorturers, who were probably the most shocking group I ever worked with. So, you go down the list and there's always something, that there you learn from. But like I say, the book, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The whole point of it was that really, as long as you can look positively and you can do things that are affordable. That was another secret, as the police, there was just 3 guys, it was cheap. Like, for instance, Oingo Boingo would be big on the West Coast, but they could never get to the East Coast because there were 12 of them.
Correct.
It was just way too expensive to get them to the East Coast. So affordability was one of the other lessons, So if you make something so expensive that you've got to happen quickly, well, maybe luck doesn't have a chance to come to action. Well, whereas with the police, we stuck it out for a year. For the first year of the police existence, they were 0.
Yeah.
But
So
the fact is, there are only 3 guys. I mean, they thankfully they lived on the dole. They were getting money from Social Security.
Yeah. Well, I would say in summary, Miles, tip of the hat, a life well lived, a career well journeyed. It's been phenomenal talking with you. Tom, would you mind flashing the book screen and the way to order it on Amazon? The book comes out in the US 1 week from today, but you can pre-order it on Amazon now. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Do check it out. It's chock full of many things we didn't have time to get to. And Miles, it is such a pleasure being with you again. It's been a while and I loved every minute.
Well, it's nice talking to you. And, you know, I'm always ready to talk. So if you want to do this again, you know my number.
I sure do. Tom, over to you. Wrap it up.
Hey, Miles, I'll echo what Kelli just said. This has been fascinating. We always cut these things off long before now. I could sit here for another 3 hours listening to the stories and the lessons. And the lessons you've shared are timeless. The things that worked for you back in the 70s and 80s are still successful lessons for today's industry. So thank you for everything you've done and that you continue to do, especially that advocating for artists. To the audience, please buy this book. I can't wait to read it myself. And please keep coming back. We'll be back here in 48 hours. We'll be back here on Thursday afternoon featuring 2 more rock stars. And with that, please get a shot and stay safe.
Bye, everybody. Be well.
All right. Take care, guys. It was fun.
Thank you.
Amen.
All right.